Start by opening up your file, and you'll look at which size you want to print in on the front, and with each size it will tell you exactly which pages to print off. So I have my size printed off. There's several more pages. You'll just cut on this dotted line and tape them together. Then to make this more rigid, I'll add a layer of tape to the front and probably the back too, but I'm using a slightly thicker paper, so I really only need to do the front. But having this more rigid will help while you're tracing it on the sheepskin. You'll want to cut this out and punch these holes first. You can do them in either order. I usually cut my parts out first, or at least get them separated from the other ones. You can use a pair of scissors too, but don't use good scissors as tape can get them kind of gummy. When you're punching these holes, I suggest going with a 5/64 inch or something equivalent. You can go a little bigger, like a 3/32, but I wouldn't go any bigger than that. The holes will really start to show up where you traced them once you punch them in the sheepskin. You can go a little smaller than the 5/64, however, it starts to get real hard to trace through those little openings. As you're getting your parts ready, you'll notice that tongue section has some optional broguing. And I added a line down the center, so if you want to grab any broguing you have or design your own, you just line it up straight with that center line. There's a couple different ways you can get this ready for tracing onto your sheepskin. You can just put a little bit of weight on it or hold it down while you're doing it, but I like to cut some sections out of the middle so I can tape it down. Just holds it a lot better. When you're looking for your sheepskin, or you already have a piece, you're going to try to find something that has a little more thickness to it, a little firmer. If it's not too thick, it'll work better for the hats and mittens and things. So I'll probably cut some of that out of this side here, and I look for the thicker, firmer spots for slippers. You can see I cut those two sections out. I'll put a link below where I get my sheepskin. But this way I can tape it down. But this tape's real sticky, so I'll press it against my pants or something, or even my hand. Get rid of some of that stickiness first so it doesn't leave any residue on the back of the sheepskin. And what I like to use are these heat erasable pens. Throw this in the dryer when you're done and those marks will vanish. For some stuff, if it goes out in below 0, these marks can appear, but they are washable as well. You can wash these out, but you also want to make sure that the sole is cut from the densest wool and the thickest skin. You can mark all these numbers and match them up later on. That's really helpful if you're sewing it on a machine. By hand, it's not as crucial. I'll probably do less of those marks. But they always help. Just make sure to get the seams at least marked, because you can always mark it out so many holes as you're sewing. Check to make sure everything's marked. You can see no residue gets left behind. Always save your patterns too. These can be reused a bunch of times. Plus, if later on you forgot a mark, you can always just set it down, get that mark on there. As far as cutting stuff out, a nice pair of sharp scissors works best for me. Just make sure you keep the bottom part of those scissors pressed up real close to that skin so you're not cutting up too much of the wool. I'm using a 0.8 millimeter. You can use a 1 millimeter. If you go too small, sometimes they'll get clogged up. You could go smaller than this, maybe a 0.5. But if you go too big, those holes will be a little bit too large. You'll see them, it won't look as clean. But I find hole punches work better as far as durability than, say, a stitching chisel. Stitching chisel is more of a slice, so it's much easier for it to peel open and pull through a little bit. So I always stick with this hole punch here. Again, that's a 0.8 millimeter. It helps if your hole punch is nice and sharp. That way it'll grip the back side of the sheepskin and it won't slide around on you. Another thing I'll mention is if you're doing broguing, the largest I go is a 1/2 inch, because behind that hole it can get a little thin as far as the wool is concerned. The broguing is optional. You can use any broguing you designed. If you choose to do these reinforcements, I highly recommend at least doing the 2 that'll be by the tongue, or all 3. There's one by the heel too. But for this one, I'm going to do the real long one for the heel. It makes it a little easier to slip it on and off. It kind of firms up that heel section a little bit. But what I'll do is grab some scraps, and you'll find there'll be pieces where you don't have a lot of fur, but that skin's nice. So I'll try to save those pieces for this. But before I trace those and do all that, I'll trim all the fur off. And you can use scissors if you want. I find a shaver works a lot better. I'll come from a couple angles just to try to get as close as I can. I'll just tape these right to it like I would a normal leatherworking pattern. Just remember to use your small hole punch, the stitching size one. You don't want to go too big at this point. If you have some big end punches, you can get through these ends real quick, or you can just cut them straight across. They'll have 2 options. You can see this one's already cut with a curve, but there is a straight option. For these ones, I do have an end punch that will work, so I'll just go right up to the edge. If you get a little snag that didn't get cut, don't pull it. You're going to make a lot of frays. Come back in with your knife. Make sure you get a nice clean cut. First seam we're going to sew will be this back heel section here. You just want to get the wool out of the way, and we'll line these holes up and clip it first. I like to put the clips right across where that stitching is going to be. Holds it nice and flat right where I want it to. And this last clip, I just put her on the corner so it holds them real flat, but still allows me access to this first hole here. There's a lot of different ways you could tie a knot. You could tie a big knot and pull it in from between the 2 layers, or you can just do what I'm doing here. And I like to go through twice, so that it holds tight while we get the rest of the knot set here. And I'll put a little dab of glue on this knot as well, just to make sure it really holds. But I'll slide it around to the side so that it'll be pulled up against that first hole there. And you may need, if you're punching larger holes, you're going to need to make a larger knot. But I'll go through this first hole a second time so that it pulls that knot against the hole and allows that very first stitch to already have that perfect angle coming across with each stitch. Just direct each stitch so it comes across nice. Pull them good and tight. And you may need to throw a clip, pull it tight, throw a clip behind there to make sure you get those good and tight. When you get to the last hole, I'll go through it twice so you get a secondary stitch that goes straight over that seam, really holding it down. And then I'll also go through it one more time and go around the top of that seam. Really holding those two together at the edge there. Just make sure it's not too close to the corner. And then you'll drop back down. At this point you can add your reinforcement piece that will go across this last part here, but I'm actually going to wait and do all those at the end because technically they're not absolutely necessary. I like to use them to really reinforce each seam where it's trying to pull apart. But to get that double stitch, you'll just fall all the way back down. And again, just direct it across so it looks nice. You don't have to pull them quite as tight, and you won't need to keep putting clips behind there because you don't want them ending up tighter than your previous stitches. So I got to the end, and I already did that stitch when I started straight over the top. So I'll just need to do one more, either through here and then tie my knot separately, or what I like to do is just tie that knot and have it come around the bottom edge here. Again, twice through. And I'll leave these long and push them through the seam as we're sewing. You can always clip the excess later on. Then we'll just grab the two ends, the long sides, and do the exact same thing. Go around each end, good and tight stitches. I got to the other end again, went through that hole a second time, and you'll do that third time through and get it up top here. Just make sure it's back far enough to hold that nicely. Then you'll just follow those stitches all the way back down. With these threads sticking out the bottom of each side, if you just grab them to get them out of the way, pull them down into the slipper, fluff that up, holds them in there nice for you. So make sure we find the bottom, and you can see this is the toe side, heel side. Just make sure we get that heel side to the heel side. And that mark that's on there, if you didn't mark it, grab your pattern, get that seam mark on there. That's going to fall right on the seam. And each hole on the side of that mark represents those two holes that you sewed through to sew that other seam here. I'll take a look and make sure these holes are lining up as I come around the radius. It'd be helpful to grab a needle or something too, if you need to kind of press that out of the way. But always check those holes and make sure they're going to line up. If you're sewing this on a machine, just use those marks that are on the pattern and just clip from those marks and throw a couple in between. You can really rip a ton of these out on your machine. You might be tempted to trim some of the wool back on these seam lines, but I strongly suggest not doing that. You want as much of that in there as you can possibly get to really keep those seams away from hitting your foot. And with all that wool, you won't even notice where the seams are. You may need to kind of give it a little twist to press the sole across to make sure these holes keep lining up. That's another good reason to keep all those marks on there, because if you go and all of a sudden 2 marks are off, you know you missed a hole somewhere. Let's go all the way around and get this clip down. With all the clips on there, double check that line is right on the seam, and each one of these holes, just like before, will fall on each side of that seam. If you have a wax thread, it might not be a huge deal, but I don't tie massive knots, so I always like to put just a little dab of glue on there. And we'll go through that same hole and do what we did before, slide that knot around right up to the hole. So now it's that other side of the seam, the hole you sewed through before to sew that seam, will fall right on the other side of that line, that mark. And we'll drop that onto that side of the seam, so when we come back around, we'll just follow onto the other side and it'll look real nice. Get it tight and keep a clip on there. When you get to that seam, you'll do the same thing. Those 2 holes will be each side of that seam that you sewed before. And the other side of the seam. Now that we got to that starting hole, we'll just turn around and go all the way back, and the stitches are all held, so we won't need any more clips. You could potentially stop at this point. I just really like to go back. I find it kind of reinforces the seams better. You don't need to put clips behind here either. You don't want these next stitches to be tighter than the previous row. That way they'll just kind of loosen up to the right tension. You don't need to pull quite as hard either. You can see when we came across, I had that stitch go on that side over that way instead of like across that corner. So now I'll just fall on the opposite side as I come across. That'll hold that seam real nice. You see, I didn't get that marked, so that's a good reason to keep these patterns around. I can lay that down and get that center. It helps to get some of the wool out of the way first. And same as before, that seam will go right on that mark. Each one of those holes will fall on each side of that seam. And again, I'll clip this whole part down before I start to sew. Taking a look at the holes, making sure they line up as I go. This will be the same as all the other seams. Go down and back, make sure we get around the outside of the seam as well to really hold it. Just start your seam on this the same as all the other ones. We'll work our way all the way around and come back. We just got to make sure we get around the outside of each side of that seam. And you can stop and put those little reinforcement pieces on now, but I'm going to wait because technically you don't have to add them, but I do highly recommend it. So we'll finish this up and I'll show you how to put those little reinforcement pieces on there. Same as before, when we get to the edge of that seam, I go through that hole a second time to go straight over, then I'll go through again so I can go over the outside. Really hold those two pieces together nice. And just work my way all the way back now. So if this is the one where you're going to put the cuff on there, you can just make your knots wherever you want. That'll be hidden up. Or if you're putting those little reinforcement pieces on, which I'll go over on the different ones here shortly. So what I'll do is I'll go around the end, but get the knot back off the edge. That way it'll be hidden by that little reinforcement piece. Now let's go through an extra hole. Now the knot will be down here underneath that piece. There's a few different ways in order which you could do this. Sew each one on separately and then hit those individual seams in between the two. I'll just line these up, and if you don't have the numbers on these, it's actually pretty easy. Where it curves up is where it's gonna come to the front there. But as long as you put those two flatter sides together, and that one will link everything. And again, these stitches get hidden when this is folded down. So you don't have to worry about making them look super pristine and keeping all the knots hidden. And then we can just tie that off. Actually, I think I'll go through another hole. All these stitches will be hidden. So I'm just going to go through another hole so that knot gets pulled back a little bit further. Just make sure when you put this next part on that the stitching holes are all on the same side. But that last hole I always go through twice, just so you get that angle and then that extra stitch going straight across just to hold everything clean. And then actually a third time. Then that third time through, so I can bring that stitch around the outside of that. Just make sure the wool's out of the way. Hold it tight and go back across. We got the two long parts and the small part. And we'll just put those two edges together to finish off that loop. Then we'll sew it to the slipper. Cuff's done. I'll get rid of some of this excess here. Since these will be hidden, I'll leave a little extra thread. No reason to cut them too close. You'll just want to match that short side with the tongue part here. So when it's completed, it will sit over like that. So I'll just flip that line those seams up together. And take a look at those holes going across, make sure they line up. Just make sure to get as much of that wool out of the way down in there as you can. This will take just a little bit more finesse to get things lined up here. I like to start at a seam. Good way to keep everything lined up, make sure all the holes are going to be correct. These stitches will try to pull apart, so it's a good idea to keep a clip right behind there to keep those stitches tight. Got to the seam where I started, and I'll just hop over it and then go right back and all the way around. What I like to do is put the fold just above that seam. You could try to do it below, but it really doesn't want to go that far. Just kind of set that fold in those seams especially. And you can do just about whatever you want to fasten that down, or even just leave it, but it tends to kind of flop up. So I like to grab a thread, go through here, and go through a stitch there, pull that down tight right there and in the back. Or you could even just flip this back up after you get that fold set in there good. Flip it back up, just put some glue on that seam. And then I would grab some clothespins or something like that. So we'll make this one just the standard ankle height. However, that extra stitching, if you do choose to do it, you're going to want to do that last and make sure you tie a knot first. And I like to put it on before those little reinforcement pieces. So we'll just start at this seam. And the reason you don't want to just continue this off of that thread is because these are pulled real tight. This you leave pretty loose, otherwise it's going to bunch up and be weird. But this does help a little bit as far as just keeping it from stretching too much. If you feel like it's nice and thick, I wouldn't worry about this much, but it could be helpful. I'll just pull it snug, that's it. And if you want to go with the double stitching so it doesn't go in and out like that, we'll just go like this. We'll put a needle on each end of this. That locks that on there. And then it's kind of like doing a saddle stitch. You'll get the equal length on both sides of this. And just go through with the next needle. And you always want to come from the back first. So this next hole, I'm coming from the back side, so any leather that gets pulled through will get pressed back down when I come back from the front again. The other thing you want to make sure you do is every time you come through, hold this thread one way or the other and always fall on the same side as you go back through. The stitches will look a lot nicer that way. They'll fall in a nice angular line. Just snug. So I'll pull down every time before I fall back through that same hole. And you want to ride along the skin when you get to that next hole. Don't go down and back through. Grab a bunch of the wool. Every time, just hold that down. You see the stitches look real nice. It falls on the same side. Otherwise, it'll look like stitches don't line up if you don't do this correctly. What I like to do also at the seams when you hit them is instead of that back needle coming up through that next hole, we'll skip just to the other side of that seam. Since these stitches have to remain pretty loose, I don't want a loose thread right here. It will get covered up by those reinforcements, however, if you go that route. And then that way it falls behind there. Real quick again, instead of coming up that next hole, I'll hop to the other side of the seam. And just continue on. Sometimes I like to give it just the tiniest bit of bunching. And that'll loosen up almost right away because the leather will compress as you wear it. But just that little bit of bunching kind of helps the fit. To tie a knot, I like to just go underneath one of these close threads here. Try to get that knot as close to the hole underneath that seam as much as possible. For the cuffed version, you don't really need to put any of these reinforcement pieces on here. However, you could put this long one on the entire back of the heel, It just makes it a little more rigid for like slipping on. But the ones that you do want it on, I mean, technically it is still optional, but you can see this one's already got it on there. And what I'll do is go through that second hole, back around and through that first hole, because this will lay right across like that. So now I can just come out this hole and go back through that second hole again to create that first stitch. And I'll leave them loose so it's easier to get everything on there, and then tighten them up. And before you go back through that first hole again, you're going to go through this. You can just pull it through there separately to make it a little easier to find all the holes here. Come back through, and we got those first 2 stitches. Come back up through that. I got those first 2 stitches. You don't have to pull it very tight yet, leave it loose. And then, because we want the next stitch to go over the top of that seam, I'll just go over and through that first hole again. Make sure the wool's out of the way, and you want to pinch that real tight, press that down. Make sure you get that going over right where you want it. And you can go over the top the same way as before, or you can do what I did here and just come over the top of the seam. However, you don't want to come out the other side of that. You want to miss that little reinforcement piece. So I'll just drop back through it, but not through the other layers. And now we can tie that knot with the 2 ends, and it'll go underneath that piece. Make sure you get it good and tight.